let's fast forward 7 years. We're probably going to backtrack later, but let's fast forward 7 years. Coming back to this discussion of the necessity defense and what actually brings you to town right now.
Yeah. So I've been here in the Seattle area for the past week supporting the Delta 5 case that has been going to trial up in Linwood, north of Seattle. And that was a case where 5 activists with Rising Tide blockaded an oil train about a year and a half ago in September 2014. They erected a tripod in front of this oil train and stayed there for 8 hours. And it was a train carrying back-end oil from North Dakota. And so they were taking their case to trial. And so I was out here as part of a new organization that I started called the Climate Disobedience Center. And I started that with some other activists who have engaged in civil disobedience and taken their case to trial for the purpose of supporting other folks in that situation and trying to maximize the potential that we see for civil disobedience as a tool of social change, and particularly to encourage people to take their cases to trial. So what was unique about the Delta 5 case was that they were only the second case of climate activists that we know of in this country that were given permission to make a necessity defense and present witnesses and expert testimony about how the risk of climate change and the harms of climate change outweigh the laws that they allegedly broke. The first of those cases, though, wasn't actually able to make that defense. They were given permission, but then on the first day of their trial, this was actually the people who started the Climate Disobedience Center with me. Theirs was a case they had anchored a lobster boat in front of the Brayton Point coal-fired power plant in Massachusetts and prevented a shipment of West Virginia coal from being delivered. So they took their case to trial, and on the first day of their trial, the district attorney came in and took over the prosecution of the case, and dropped all the criminal charges, and then came outside to all the folks that we had gathered, all the media that we had gathered, and gave this big speech about how he was dropping the charges out of concern for all the children who would be impacted by climate change. Said that there's been a serious failure of political leadership on this that necessitates this kind of action. It was right before the big climate march, and he held up Bill McKibben's article from Rolling Stone. And he said, "I've been having all my staff read this, and I'm going to be marching in New York in a couple weeks." It was pretty mind-blowing. But anyway, they didn't get to make the necessity defense. So this week was the first time that climate activists have actually been able to present that case. And so I was here helping to advise them on that and helping to get media attention for it and basically just trying to kind of integrate what's happening in the courtroom with the larger movement context and what's happening in our campaigns.
And so that trial was going on this week.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the outcome?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about this was they had first requested permission for making the necessity defense. And the judge said no, denied them. Then they filed a motion to reconsider, which is kind of like what lawyers always do when they don't like something. They just file a motion saying, "But what about this?" And it's, which is kind of like when a kid, their parent tells them they can't do something, and they're like, "But what about?" It's like, it never works, right? But this time it actually worked. The judge actually reconsidered and changed his own decision 2 days later. Like he made a ruling, they motioned to reconsider. 2 days later, he goes, "You're right. Judges are often not humble enough, and I think we need a little more humility in the judiciary. I'll allow evidence to be presented in this case, and then I'll decide after the evidence if the necessity defense is warranted," which was a really unusual ruling. So they were able to present pretty much everything that they wanted, and it was really remarkable to watch. They presented this clear, coherent case that justifies climate activism. So they had climate scientists on the stand talking about what we face. They had rail safety experts talking about how dangerous these oil trains were rolling through these neighborhoods. and why this is so unprecedented. They themselves all took the stand and talked about their decades of climate activism, of trying to work within the system, of writing letters and petitions. Several of them had run for office in various ways, talked about the organizations that they started, talked about the businesses that they started. I mean, they had a ton of experience working within the system among the 5 of them. So they were able to present all of that and make the explanation of why it didn't work. So there was expert testimony about the Exxon knew revelations and how Exxon knew about climate change since the 1970s, and then in the late 80s decided to start denying it and created this incredible denial machine that corrupted our government. They talked about money in politics. They talked about the erosion of democracy. It was incredible to see all of this presented. And almost every time the prosecution would object and try to silence any of that testimony, he would get overruled. The judge was entirely on the side of the defense the entire time. I'll also mention the judge was about my age, which I think might have had a little something to do with that. It was going incredibly well up until around noon of yesterday. And then things got weird.